Mr. Barlow, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, sir.
How would you like to identify yourself?
Well, first of all, I'm an African. I'm also a South African, and I see what I do. I advise governments and their armed forces in terms of national security. It's what I do. If governments have a requirement, whether it be political or security, and they speak to me, I advise them as best I can.
Isn't it true that you're one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, who moved this trade of mercenary activity from just an individual trade into a fully fledged industry?
Well, I think we were probably the first company, or a private company, that was contracted by a national government to add value to their national security strategy and in order to bring an end to conflict in their country. So if that's considered to be a pioneer, then yes, we were.
Are we talking about the South African government?
No, we're talking about the Angolan government.
Why do you think people in your industry feel so sensitive to the word mercenary?
I think there are some people that feel sensitive towards it, and I'm one of them. We don't see ourselves as mercenaries. We're first of all contracted by a national government. We become part of their armed forces. We wear their uniforms. We follow their procedures and guidelines. We fall under the legal regulations of that country. So in other words, we serve that country that contracts us. And yes, we get paid for it, but we certainly don't get paid to run around and cause chaos.
But according to all English dictionaries, the word mercenary means, and let me read it out, a soldier who is paid to fight by a country or group that they do not belong to, and synonymous is soldier of fortune.
It's an interesting definition. There are many soldiers who serve in armed forces of countries where they were not born. There are people serving in European armies that were born in Africa. Are they then mercenaries? The South African Defence Force recruited people during its pre-1994 era that were born in different countries. Were those people mercenaries? So therefore I dispute the argument. To me, I serve the client, which is a government. I'm responsible for the men placed under my command, and I'm accountable to that government.
Unlike armies that are being forced into wars by politicians, you and your business, you choose to go to war. What is the fine line between the moral and the immoral, especially in light of those accusations against some companies in your industry that they tend to prolong wars to generate more money?
I'd like to go back and start off where your question ended. First of all, I've served in no company that has prolonged a war or a conflict. In fact, we have ended conflicts in very short spaces of time, because that is the mission that a government gives to us, and that is to bring an end to conflict in order to enable governance to be re-established or negotiations to take place. I think there is a fine line between moral and immoral, but that really goes back to the people that are involved. If you engage people in a country that are ill-disciplined, that have no self-respect, that do not respect people, they are going to commit deeds that are immoral. As far as we're concerned, we give an undertaking to a government that we will end the conflict, and that is what we have done every time. So we've never prolonged a conflict. In fact, we've ended them, despite them carrying on for decades and decades. We've ended them in a very short space of time. But I am aware of companies that do not mind if the conflict continues, because that's the goose that lays the golden egg, and they certainly don't want to stop it.
In spite of the successes you achieved, your company achieved both in Angola and Sierra Leone, the two governments of the two countries, they terminated the contracts of executive outcomes. Why do you think the two governments, in spite of all these successes, terminated your contracts?
Well, I think first of all, Angola, one needs to bear in mind that if you read the contract, which was awarded to us, was initially a 12-month contract to train a brigade in order to take the war to the enemy at that stage, UNITA, and to bring about an end to hostilities. That contract was extended for about 3.5 years, so they didn't end the contract. They did, however, end the contract as soon as UNITA had been defeated on the battlefield, and they were under pressure from the United Nations in particular, who saw us as a threat possibly to their own deployments in Angola. The same applied to Sierra Leone. That was a very vicious and brutal civil war. That was ended in a very short space of time. The Sierra Leonean government asked us to stay. The World Bank and the IMF, however, put pressure on them to get rid of us so that the UN and other foreign forces could come in. And in both instances, both those countries returned to war. So I would argue exactly the opposite.
Was there ever a serious investigation by any of the intelligence service into the accusations that your company, Executive Outcome, faced?
Yes, there was. The first investigation took place in 1993. That was driven by the South African Department of Foreign Affairs and encouraged by military intelligence, as well as some white-collar companies that were profiting off the illegal purchase of diamonds from rebel groups. In that instance, the Attorney General issued a statement to say that they are not, there is no reason at all to actually take the matter further because the evidence laid before them was really non-existent. And then after Executive Outcomes closed its doors, there was a very lengthy intelligence report that was produced. I don't know who produced it, in which it actually found that all the accusations leveled against the company were false, that a lot of them were malicious lies in order to slander the company, and that there was no further basis for investigation into the company.
Besides the military and the combat services, you say that your company provides also non-combat and non-military services to your clients. Could you give us some examples?
Yes. For example, in 1 month in 1995, we provided medical aid to more than 1,000 people of the local population living around one of our specific bases. We also provided in excess of 50,000 litres of clean drinking water a day to the local people. Of course, this had a huge impact on those who were importing bottled water and selling it at great costs. We collected medicines from hospitals in South Africa that were time expired. Those medicines were flown to Angola in particular, and our medical staff used those medicines on the sick and infirm in Angola. And of course, that created huge problems. So these are just some of the examples.
Would you walk us through the Boko Haram offensive?
Boko Haram offensive was really not part of Executive Outcomes. That was STEP International that actually partook in that offensive. I need to first of all make it very clear that we were a subcontractor. There was a prime contractor appointed that appointed us as a subcontractor. Our initial aim was not Boko Haram per se, but it was to rescue the Chibok girls. They were the girls that had been kidnapped, and where the Western response was #SaveTheGirls. That type of nonsense does not save girls. Unfortunately, these girls became victims of a situation where the security had broken down in a specific area. They were kidnapped, and that was the first mission, rescue the Chibok girls. We then did a selection process of the Nigerian soldiers. The soldiers were retained after the selection process, were then trained in a very specific way to conduct a hostage rescue operation. And that requires a very specific type of person. However, approximately 5 or 6 weeks into the training of the hostage rescue team, we were asked to change our mission. And that mission was to go to a town called Maiduguri in northeast Nigeria that had come under severe threat of Boko Haram. We then rapidly had to transition what we were doing and suddenly train a very offensive force with a minimum of equipment, and we rushed to Maiduguri. We met with the 7th Infantry Division commander. We finally understood the pressures he was under, and our suggestion was to him that this force we had trained, which we named the 72nd Mobile Strike Force, would actually spearhead the division. And that is precisely what we did. The operation was in 3 phases. The first phase was to actually cut a dividing line across northeastern Nigeria and isolate Boko Haram into 2 defined areas, and then mop up one area in the south was the start, and after that was done, mop up in the north. The division would follow behind, occupy terrain. We would train the division in situ in defensive positions, etc., but we were never allowed to execute the entire operation. So in 1 month, we took back terrain larger than Belgium from Boko Haram. We were not allowed to finish because it came at a time when governments were in the process of changing. I think President Jonathan's government possibly saw the entire Boko Haram contract, if we call it that, almost as a last gasp in order to regain popularity. The incoming president, President Buhari, was heavily supported by a foreign government, and one of the first missions was to terminate our contract.
Could you name that foreign government?
Yes, we were told it was the United States, and they had actually funded President Buhari's campaign. The campaign manager for President Buhari came from the US. And I'm not saying that the United States is bad. I understand foreign interests, but I would have thought that a threat such as Boko Haram on the integrity of the state of Nigeria ought to be actually a priority. It wasn't.
Why do you think the US would intervene to abort such operation?
Again, I can't answer that. I think that the US can answer, but what I've come to realize that is when a government's foreign interests clash with the state's own domestic interests, conflict is bound to ensue. And those conflicts usually just continue with no end. And we can look at all the conflicts in Africa where foreign forces have come in, they've prolonged those conflicts, they haven't ended those conflicts. And the amount of money and manpower and equipment thrown at those conflicts says to me that something is wrong if no end result is achieved. And surely that end result should be to end the conflict and establish a basis for negotiations, come to an agreement, and then re-establish governance. But that's not what's happening in Africa.
How much did you charge the Nigerian government?
Well, first of all, we didn't charge the Nigerian government. And I think here that is a question the Nigerian government can answer. We were one subcontractor. So in other words, the Nigerian government appointed a contractor, and we contracted to that contractor as their subcontractor. So I think that's all I'll say. If you're really interested in the figures, that's for the Nigerian government to discuss.
Have you ever operated in Sudan?
Yes, but I need to clarify here, it was Southern Sudan. We had a contract to train a very specialist group for the Ugandan People's Defence Force. While the training was ongoing in northwest Uganda, I was deployed to Nazara, which was the home of the 4th Infantry Division. The Ugandans then later redeployed me into the DRC to attach myself to one of the infantry battalions that was deployed there, while the training for their special group was still ongoing. I then deployed with the special group into the DRC, later into the Central African Republic with the second one, and at a stage we went into an area which is very contentious, known as Darfur. But I need to state that those movements across borders were all agreed to by the governments in question, and that the governments in question authorized that Ugandan troops could operate in those countries. So in that sense, yes, I've operated in Sudan, albeit mainly southern Sudan.
So you had the approval of the Sudanese government?
Yes, there would be the approval of the government because that was an agreement signed between all partaking governments, and that was to counter the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA. It had its origins in Uganda. It started as a semi-religious movement and then transitioned into a movement aimed purely at terrorizing the local population, kidnapping of young children and forcing them to become child soldiers. As the Ugandan forces were combating the Lord's Resistance Army, they moved into the LRA, into the DRC, forgive me, and then into Central African Republic as well, where they had, for want of a better word, bases in order to secure themselves. Our mission was really to track them down, rescue child soldiers that had been deployed with them, and to bring an end to this campaign of terror conducted by the LRA. Our mission was purely to be in a town called Nazara, which is home of the 4th Infantry. We did not really liaise or interact with the South Sudanese forces.
Were you ever involved in this chaos in Somalia? And if so, in which capacity?
We were never involved in Somalia per se. What I can tell you is that we were approached by a shipping company in the early days of the piracy. We actually met with the pirates from Ile. We met them in Nairobi. We got to understand why they were pirates. Between the pirates and ourselves, we came to an agreement as to what would get them to stop being pirates. when that proposal was submitted to the shipping company, they were not interested in following it. So I think one needs to understand that the way that we view this is that piracy is big business. It's actually not what it appears to be. It was not that we were hired for a long term. We were contracted to come up with a proposal for them. In order to come up with a coherent and sensible proposal, we decided to meet the pirates, because that's the best way to understand why they are pirates. However, the end result of the meeting with the pirates was something the shipping companies didn't want to accept. And that has cost a huge amount of money and life at the moment. And piracy has now become a major problem out there, despite what everyone's saying. And our concern is that it is not only confined to Somalia, it's moved down south, it's moved north, and it's starting very, very viciously on the west coast of Africa. When you speak to the pirates, and I'm speaking of in the early days, I'm not speaking of now, fishing stocks had been depleted because of toxic waste dumping off the coast, and these were fishermen. They knew the sea, they understood the sea, and therefore, once the fish were gone, the next fish to catch was a ship. And that is what they did. However, this has transitioned into a major business now, where every ship that appears to be vulnerable or weak is targeted by them for capture.
How do you explain this seemingly paradox? Many Western countries are hunting down your contracts, while at the same time seeking your expertise by inviting you to lecture in war colleges in the US, Russia, Czech Republic, and many other countries.
I think, first of all, I don't see a problem at all with people wanting to exploit the knowledge base that we've built up. We are, after all, Africans who work in Africa, but I do think there's a major concern that Africans can actually end African conflicts. If you have a look at the conflicts in Africa, the most recent being in Mozambique, and we see the dismal performance of a private military company, to me that doesn't hold any good. What are they doing there? If they're not going to add value and bring about a sense of stability and peace, then they shouldn't be there. But unfortunately, this has been allowed to drag on. There are countries that have had private military companies operating there for years, along with national armed forces, yet the problems never go away. They actually seem to intensify. And these are things that really concern me. In terms of knowledge, we've built up a huge knowledge base. We are Africans. We are not only from South Africa, but we are from many African countries as part of STEP, as we had in executive outcomes. We understand the culture. We understand the traditions of people. We can converse with them. And we look at all these private military companies going into Africa. They just charge in. They don't understand the environment that they're in. They don't understand the area of operations. They don't understand the people. And very quickly they offend the people. And oftentimes the people become collateral damage because of a poor way in which they are approached. And all that does is it really just lengthens the conflict.
Recently, you published a book titled The Composite Warfare. What is the composite warfare? And did you just theorize on this, or was it based on your field experience?
Well, it's titled Composite Warfare, The Conduct of Successful Operations in Africa. And I wrote that book explicitly for African armies, because I think the time has come for many African armies to realize the doctrine that they are using does not work in their countries. It's been proven over and over again. And if we really look at doctrine, we're looking at British colonies apply a British doctrine, French colonies apply a French doctrine. These doctrines don't work. Most of them come from World War II. They've never been updated, re-evaluated, and besides, doctrine is related to the terrain in which you're operating in. Doctrine tells you how to do things. It does not dictate what you should do. In other words, doctrine will tell you that if you need to go and drink a glass of water, you get up, you walk to the cupboard, you take a glass, you fill it up with water and you drink it. It doesn't tell you which route to take. It doesn't tell you which glass to take. It doesn't tell you which tap to take your water from. That's just an example of doctrine. So we have this massive mismatch of doctrine versus the terrain versus the enemy or the threat. And these templates that are being superimposed on Africa are, failing wherever they're trying to be superimposed on. I know of no great success, which tells me that there is something very, very wrong with the doctrine.
Last summer, there was a frenzy recruitment in Pretoria by men who posed as representatives of your company,
Yes.
STIP. The goal was to get combatants to fight for the Libyan rebel leader, Haftar. Why did Blackwater have to impersonate STIP? And did you take any legal action against Blackwater?
Well, first of all, we took no legal action against anyone because we didn't have proof of who it really was. We were aware that there were South Africans trying to recruit. In fact, there was an office set up not too far from where we are at the moment that claimed that they were STEP International and they were recruiting people for Libya. We immediately exposed them, and we exposed them in the media, which ironically the media did for once publish. And we went looking for these people, but they moved their office very quickly. We then put a warning out to everyone who we know not to agree with these people, not to sign contracts, because as soon as a contractor starts lying about who he is, he's going to be lying to that government that he's trying to get a contract from. So we will not tolerate people using our name.
If you were offered a contract to fight for Haftar, would you have agreed?
We've been asked that question often. We cannot fight for a force, an anti-government force that's actually trying to overthrow a UN-recognized government. We will support any UN-recognized government as long as they are not the perpetrators of acts of violence against their population. We've turned down contracts from UN-recognized governments, but where that government has acted in a very evil way towards its own people.
Let's talk more about money. Is it the only thing that would get you to accept a contract? And what jobs you have turned down?
First of all, let's start with what we've turned down. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I will take you back to a country which was known as Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a previous president asked us to get involved in assassinating one of his ministers.
Who's that president?
We will continue our conversation with Eeben Barlow on the next episode of Talk to Al Jazeera.